guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to our new Bible study series. I am so beyond excited to be getting back into this. As you can see from the title for this series, we are going to be going through the book of Ruth. If you have watched some of my videos on Christian singleness and dating, you've definitely heard me reference this story in those videos just because it is one of the great love stories in the Bible. And the Bible doesn't specifically speak on dating, but there are general principles of wisdom that we can glean on dating and relationships from stories like the one of Ruth and Boaz. But the story of Ruth and Boaz isn't just a love story, and it's actually not even just about Ruth and Boaz. The story of Ruth and Boaz is actually a story of redemption, and it points to the greater story of redemption that has been bought for us in Jesus Christ. And so I am so excited to dig into this book and to go through it with you guys. I had actually already been planning to do this book for the next Bible study series, and then a couple months back in the Zoom Bible study I've been a part of with my friend Tara at church, we went through the book of Ruth, and it just got me all the more excited. Tara actually made a couple videos on her own YouTube channel of what we covered in that Bible study, so be sure to check that out. Tara is one of a handful of people who is sort of a friend slash mentor figure to me. She's someone I really look up to and has a lot of wisdom, so be sure to check out her channel, subscribe, because she's got some incredible stuff there. And she's also making videos on some of the other characters that we've studied in our Zoom Bible study, so be sure to check that out. Anytime you start reading a new book of the Bible, it is so important to understand the context of that book. I always recommend the Bible Project as a great resource. They do videos on every book of the Bible covering the context and giving an overview of the book, and it's always really helpful to watch those just to have some understanding as you're going into a new book. And so in preparation for this series, I watched the Bible Project overview on Ruth, and then I also watched a couple sermons and read through the context and commentary on Ruth in my study Bible. And so I'm going to have all those resources I used linked down below if you want to do some further study, which I definitely recommend. But then I'm also going to give just a brief overview right now of some of the main points I took from those here to sort of set the stage, and then we'll delve more into it as we go throughout the book. So context, a couple important things to know about the book of Ruth is that one, it is named for the main character, Ruth, and Ruth was a Moabite woman who marries Boaz, who is a man from Bethlehem in the town of Judah. As for the author of the book of Ruth is actually not named in the Bible, so we don't know who wrote it, but we do know that it was written in the time of the Judges. So the book of Ruth comes directly after the book of Judges, and Judges was a time period in Israel's history where they didn't have a king, but they were ruled by judges. And we're going to get more into the significance of that context as we get into this book, but that's one thing to keep in mind. Themes, some key themes in the book of Ruth. One is kindness. 2 is redemption, like we already talked about a little bit, and 3 is God's sovereignty. You're going to see that play out so beautifully as this story unfolds. It is seriously incredible, and I can't wait. And then as for genre, the genre is narrative or story. And because the genre is story, the structure of this Bible study video is going to look a little bit different than some of the ones I've done before. So far I've done a Bible study series on Philippians, James, and Galatians, and 2 of those are letters that the Apostle Paul wrote. So they're letters written to the church, and that's a very different genre than something like a story. And so typically in those Bible study series, what I've done is I'll read through the entire chapter once on camera, and I'll stop to share thoughts as we're going. But because the genre of this is story, I want to break that story up as least as possible. So instead of pausing to share thoughts as I'm reading it, what I'm going to do is read through the entire chapter once without stopping so that we can just get the story in its entirety, at least chapter by chapter, and then we'll go back through it a second time and delve a little bit deeper in and point out some of those thoughts or those contextual points as we go. And then once we finish that, as always, we'll pick a couple verses to dig deeper into or to meditate on. In Joshua 1:8, God commands us to not let the word of his law depart from our mouths, but to meditate on it day and night. And to meditate simply means to think deeply or to focus one's mind on for a period of time. So when we're reading scripture and studying scripture, we're not just meant to ingest it quickly, but we're meant to dwell on it, to ponder on it, and to spend time on it. And in these Bible study videos, when I pick a couple verses to study deeper and to spend a little bit more time on, that's a way of practicing meditation, of dwelling on these verses. And so I encourage you to do that along with me. And then also, if your attention is drawn to even a different verse than maybe the one I pick, I encourage you to do the same thing, to just spend some time studying that verse a little bit deeper. And maybe that's even an opportunity to memorize that verse and practice storing it in your heart. And so one more thing before we jump into reading, I just wanted to mention that all the tools I'm going to be using, my journaling Bible, study Bible, commentaries, highlighters, pens, everything, all of it will be linked below. And that's the case for all of my Bible study videos. I know I get that question a lot. And so if you ever want to check out one of the resources I used, just check the description below. Everything will be linked. And so without further ado, if you have a Bible, go ahead and pull it out and turn to Ruth chapter 1 and we'll read it. Verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, Is this Naomi? She said to them, Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. It was so hard not to stop as I was reading that because this story is so rich and there's so much to unpack, but let's do that now. So I decided how I'm gonna do this is go through it by section. So there's 3 sections in chapter 1 and we'll just go through them and delve a little bit deeper by section. So the first section is verses 1 through 4, and in your Bible that will be designated by the subheading Naomi Widowed. And so really though this first section is giving us the context and it's setting the stage for the story that's about to unfold. I have some notes here I'm going to be reading from, but the first thing I want to point out is the line that says in the time when the judges ruled. So like I was mentioning in the intro, this is set in the time period of the judges, and this was the time in Israel's history when there was no king, but judges ruled the land. And to get a little bit of an idea of what that time period was like, I want to read the very last book in the book of Judges. Remember that comes right before Ruth, and so I'm going to read that. It's Judges 21:25, and here's what it says. It says, In those days there was no king in Israel. everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so that should give you a little bit of a taste. If you read through the book of Judges, you'll get the whole story of just all of the crazy stuff that happened in that time period when there was really no standard of right and wrong. People just did what they thought was right. There was no king ruling the land. And so this was a time period in Israel's history that was spiritually very dark and desperate. And the book of Judges gives us an overview of this time period from sort of a big picture lens, and Ruth is essentially a spotlight story that is looking in and zooming in on this one family story and how it's unfolding during this time period. And so chronologically, Ruth falls within the book of Judges as far as the time period goes, and it's just zooming in and giving us this story. The second thing I want to point out about these first 4 verses is Elimelech. So right off the bat, we're introduced to this character Elimelech, who is the husband of Naomi, and he is a man from Bethlehem in this town of Judah, an Israelite. And the first thing I want to look at is the meaning of his name. And so all throughout the Bible, you'll see that names generally have significance, and oftentimes the meaning of a person's name is tied to the purpose that God has for that person's life. And so with Elimelech, if we look at what his name means in Hebrew, which is what the Old Testament is written in, his name means "my God is king." How cool is that to think about, that they are living in a time period when there is literally no king. Israel does not have a king. It is chaos because of that. Yet Elimelech, his name holds this promise of God for his people, saying, "My God is king." And so here they are living in this town of Bethlehem, which, if you know the nativity story of Jesus's birth, you know that Bethlehem is the town where Jesus is born. And Bethlehem also has a really cool meaning, especially in light of that knowledge. And Bethlehem means house of bread. And so here Elimelech and Naomi and his family, they were living in Bethlehem, this place of promise that Jesus was ultimately going to come through, that means house of bread, and Jesus is the bread of life. Yet in this town with this name, house of bread, they're in the middle of this famine. And it was in this famine that Elimelech decides to move his family from this town of Bethlehem to Moab. And Moab was a town that was on the other side of the Dead Sea, and the Moabites were enemies of Judah. It was a pagan culture. And so the question we have to ask ourselves at this point in the story is, why did Elimelech leave? Did Elimelech leave from Bethlehem to Moab because God directed him to? Or perhaps did he leave in fear because there was this famine in the land and he was afraid that in this famine, God was not going to provide to him? We have to ask ourselves, why did he leave this land of the promise to go to this pagan culture? And the answer is that we don't know the answer to that question. We don't know what Elimelech's motivation was, but there is an important principle to point out. And that is to say that when we do take matters into our own hands, which again, we don't know if that's what Elimelech was doing, if he was acting in fear, but when we do take matters into our own hands, we often make matters worse. So again, we don't know that Elimelech was acting in fear. God could have told his family to move up from Bethlehem into Moab. We actually have another example of that biblically in the story of Joseph, when God directs Joseph and his family up out of Canaan and into Egypt during a time of famine. And so the issue here isn't moving because of a famine. The issue here is one of motivation. That if we are doing so, if we are moving from dire circumstances because God is commanding us to, then that is a good thing. But if we are moving out of fear and out of a lack of trust that God could provide within those negative circumstances, that is when we have a problem. And so Elimelech brings his family to this pagan country. There they live, there they dwell, and the sons marry these Moabite women. And then Elimelech dies, his sons die, and Naomi is left alone with her 2 daughters-in-law. And once again, we don't know Elimelech's motivation, but we do know that even if it was a decision that he made in fear that ultimately brought destruction to his family, in the sense that their time in Moab was not good for them, they did not flourish in that time, even if that was a decision made in fear, this story shows us the basic principle that even our poor choices cannot override God's ultimate plans for us, because God, as we're going to see, still had a plan for Elimelech's family, for Naomi, for Ruth, and that plan was still enacted despite whatever motivation Elimelech had in making his decision. The next thing I want to point out are some of the meanings of names. So we already covered Elimelech's name, which again means "my God is king," and then Naomi, her name in the Hebrew means pleasantness. And then Ruth, her name means companion or friend. And so a couple other important things to know about Ruth is, again, she was a Moabite woman. The Moabites were descendants of Lot, and I encourage you to go read up on Lot and understand just the significance of that. But if you know bits of his story, you know that there was just a lot of corruption and perverseness in his family, and the Moabites were descendants from Lot. He was the nephew of Abraham, and so there's sort of this split between these two groups of people. And in addition to being descendants of Lot, the Moabites were actually known for prostitution and child sacrifice. They would sacrifice their kids to Molech, which was a satanic deity. And so the Moabites were not this upstanding group of people. The Israelites were discouraged from marrying them because of their worship of these false gods and their sacrifice to these satanic deities. Another important thing to note about Ruth, which is a little detail I didn't ever catch until going through this Bible study with Tara, because it's just a little verse and a little mention that you don't really think about, is that she was married to this man, her husband, for 10 years before he died, and in that time they didn't have any children. And so the Bible doesn't explicitly say that she was barren or what the issue was there, why they hadn't had children, but in this time, in this culture and this custom, that was one of the main purposes of women in marriage, was to bear children. And so she had gone 10 years married to this man without having any children, without having any fruitfulness. And in this culture, that would have been an immense source of shame for Ruth. And so she has a lot of things that are honestly just not going for her. She is a Moabite. They're known for these horrible practices. She has not had any children. She's had this fruitlessness in her marriage for 10 years. And now she doesn't even have hope of having a child within marriage because her husband has died. And so for a woman in that culture and in that time, Ruth would have been without a hope and without a future, because without a husband and without a means of having children and carrying on a family line, Ruth was without a hope and without a future. So was Naomi. They were in this destitute place. I told you that was a lot of context for 4 verses, but how much richness do those insights bring to the story even already? So moving on now into the second section, this is verses 16 through 18, and it's designated in your Bible under the subheading of Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. And so here Naomi has found herself in Moab. She's lost her husband, she's lost both of her sons, and she's got these 2 Moabite women as daughters-in-law. And she hears that the famine that's been going on in Bethlehem, her hometown, has lifted, and now there's food in the land. And so she decides that she's going to go back to Bethlehem, and she's trying to convince her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab. So in that culture, it was customary that if a woman's husband died, that the brother would step in to provide that woman with children so she could perpetuate the family line. But in the case of Ruth, her husband died, and her husband's brother had also died. So there were no more brothers, nobody who was going to be able to help her perpetuate her family lineage. And so Naomi is saying to Ruth and to Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, look, I don't have any more sons to carry on a family line for you guys. Even if I were to get married and get pregnant tonight, are you really going to wait for that son to grow up to become your husband? Like, no, I can't offer you guys anything. You need to return to your families, return to your gods here in Moab, and that is your best hope of having a husband. And so this is the argument that Naomi is making, and then she really drives that argument home by saying, as if that wasn't enough, this practical reason that I can't give you a husband, you also shouldn't stay with me because clearly the hand of the Lord has been against me. He hasn't done well by me, and so if you stay with me, there's just really nothing good for you. God is not going to provide. This is the mentality and the mindset that Naomi is in convincing her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab. And quite honestly, if Ruth and if Orpah were looking to remarry and have families, which they would have been, it didn't make sense for them to go with Naomi because, again, she had no way of having a son to give to them as a husband. She had nothing to offer them, and so it didn't make sense for them to go with Naomi. But as we're going to see from this story, Ruth, in obedience, when we are obedient to God, God is able to make a way even when it doesn't make sense, and God is going to provide in this story. And so I want to point out a distinction between Naomi's disposition and Ruth's disposition. This is something I actually got from one of the sermons I listened to. I believe it was the David Platt one, but he just painted a picture of this contrast between Naomi and Ruth. So Naomi is in this self-described state of bitterness toward God, saying, look, the hand of the Lord has been against me. Don't come with me because nothing good is happening to me. Turn back to your gods, back to your family, back to your culture. And she said this to Ruth knowing what all of that entailed, knowing what their culture was about, knowing the gods they served were not the true God. And so this is Naomi's disposition of one of distrust and bitterness. And then there's the disposition of Ruth, where she responds with this statement of faith, where she says, no, I will not depart from you. I will not return to Moab. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And this is significant because we know that Ruth is a Moabite and that they worship these false gods, these pagan gods. But in this statement, she is pledging an allegiance and a commitment not only to Naomi, but to the God of Israel. And it denotes this shift that would have happened in her, that sometime in those 10 years that she had been living with this Israelite family, she had come to know the God of Israel, and she was now saying, I am not going to go back to the Moabite gods. I'm going to go with you, and your God is going to be my God. And so Ruth makes this statement of faith saying, you know what, it doesn't make sense for me to go with you, but I'm not going to go back to these things. I'm going to go with you. And it was a statement of faith and trust, and it was faith in action, because her doing this required her to leave everything she had ever known and to step into something that was entirely unknown to go with Naomi. Yet this is the response that Ruth has, and the verb there that says she clung to Naomi, that Orpah turned back to go to her family, but Ruth clung to Naomi. That is the same word that is used in the Bible to refer to marriage when it says, and then they shall leave their father and mother and cling to one another. They should leave and cleave, right? And so this verb is one of commitment, and it is denoting Ruth's commitment, again, not only to Naomi, but to the God of Israel. So now moving on to the final section of the book, verses 19 through 22. This is under the subheading, Naomi and Ruth return. So Ruth and Naomi are going back to Bethlehem. They arrive in Bethlehem after these 10 years have passed. Naomi has experienced just horrible loss of her husband, of her 2 sons, and she's now returning to this place where she is from, and they literally don't even recognize her because life has taken its toll on Naomi. And they call out to her, and she says, no, don't call me Naomi. Again, remembering that Naomi means pleasant. She says, call me Mara, which means bitter. She says, call me Mara because God has dealt bitterly with me. And then she says, I went away full and I came back with nothing. And I want you to just pause right there in the story and imagine that you're Ruth. If you're Ruth, you've just made this statement of faith, this commitment, this declaration of loyalty to Naomi. You've left behind everything that you've ever known to go with Naomi to this foreign land that you've never been to. You're a Moabite woman, and so you already have all these assumptions about who you are because of what the Moabites practice and what they believe in. And so you're walking into this town where you're likely getting stares of judgment. You're likely the talk of the town, and not in a good way. People are looking at you, making assumptions about who you are because of where you're from. And the only person you have that you've just committed everything to, Naomi, she is now going to her friends and saying, I went away full and I came back with nothing. And given obviously Naomi has experienced tremendous loss, but she's now saying, I have nothing, and Ruth is standing right there, and it's like, okay, well, what am I? And so this is what Ruth is returning to. And now they find themselves here in Bethlehem with 2 great needs. They have a need, 1 for family and 2 for food. And the great question is, who is going to provide? So we get to the end of chapter 1 and we find Naomi in this place where she is destitute, she's hopeless, and she's bitter. But she has no idea what God is about to do. And the very end of this chapter, we get this glimmer of hope, this sort of teaser that says, and they arrived in Bethlehem just as the barley harvest had begun. Because God's timing is always perfect. The barley harvest would have been in the springtime, and it would have been this plentiful time of harvest. And so we're about to see these 10 years of fruitlessness in the land of Moab juxtaposed with this plentiful harvest that is just about to begin. And if you want to watch what God will do, then you need to return back next week for chapter 2. But as for now, we're going to pick a couple verses from this chapter to again meditate on. And I'm going to pick the classic one from this chapter, verse 16 through 17. So I'm going to pull out my Scribe Bible journal and we'll dig in. Okay, so I wrote out this verse. I'm going to read it again. It says, but Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death departs me from you. I added an accidental extra word there. But anyways, so the first thing that really strikes me about this verse is just the fierce loyalty that Ruth is displaying. And so I'm just going to make a note on that. So I just put that Ruth displays a fierce loyalty to Naomi. I think it's also interesting to note that this verse, or these two verses, are oftentimes used in wedding vows between a husband and a wife, but the original context of these words being said was from a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law. So I just want to make that little note too. So I wrote there that this context of this is loyalty from a daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law, even though this verse is used to depict commitment in marriage vows. And then I'm going to read a couple notes from the commentary on this as well. So I'm reading right here. It says, returning to her people meant returning to her gods, since gods and territory went together. So Ruth's decision had far-reaching spiritual implications. Her confession of faith, your people, my God, recalls the central covenant promise. I will be your God and you shall be my people. So I'm just going to make a note here, again, reiterating what we talked about, that Ruth's statement was actually a declaration of faith in God. So I put that Ruth's statement is a declaration of faith in the true God, and that she wasn't just committing to Naomi, but also to the God of Israel. And then I want to read one last note from the commentary that references verse 17, where it's saying Ruth binds herself by an oath that invites punishment if she is unfaithful. She swears this oath in the name of Yahweh, thereby owning him as her God. So I'm just going to put that note there saying that Ruth, she binds herself by an oath that invites punishment if she is unfaithful. And I just want to take a moment to again really reflect on the commitment in this statement that Ruth is making, because she is saying here, where you go, I will go. So where you live, that's where I'm going to live. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. So she's taking on Naomi's location. She's taking on her community. She's taking on her deity most significantly, which was again a decision Ruth had made. And then she's also saying, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. I read a note in another commentary, or it might have been the sermon I listened to, I'm not sure, that was saying burial in those times was believed to have implications for the afterlife. So Ruth was making a monumental commitment in these things that she said, because they have implications not only for life, but in that belief system that she's departing from, also in the afterlife. And so she's making this commitment and then saying, may the Lord do to me, and more also, if anything but death departs me from you. And so she makes this oath that invites punishment again if she is unfaithful. And the thing that really strikes me as I'm thinking through all of this is that Ruth is literally risking everything and laying everything on the line to make this commitment of loyalty to Naomi and this statement of faith and commitment and obedience to God. She was making herself completely dependent on him. And so I'm just going to make some notes about that here in the application. So I just wrote that out. I put Ruth risks everything and puts everything on the line to remain loyal to Naomi and to step out in faith and trust God. She makes herself entirely dependent on him. She puts herself in this scenario where if God doesn't come through for her, then she's utterly destitute, left without anything. And so the stage is being set for God to move. That is all for Ruth chapter 1. Let me know down in the comments what you learned from this study, any of the verses that stood out to you. I love reading through your thoughts and just talking about it in community down in the comments. So read through some other people's comments too and just engage down there. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, and then also hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet. And I will see you back here next week for Ruth chapter 2. Bye.